Friends, today we're in the portion of Behar. We're in the 32nd gift. And today we're talking about ownership, acquisitions and ownership. And we'll start with the 10th of December 1948, where the United Nations proclaimed in the 17th chapter that every individual has the right of ownership, ownership of land, ownership of property. It's the inherent rights of a person to own something. Two schools of philosophy. One is headed by Jean-Jacques and his comrades. We're talking about Hume and Kant and Hegel. All those philosophers says that a person has a right of ownership. Opposing them is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who says that a person does not have a natural right of ownership. Ownership belongs to the state, to the society, and they give the individuals the right of ownership. And as we quote from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, you will be lost if you will forget that all the fruits of the land belongs to everyone, and that the land does not belong to nobody, which means does not belong to any individual. Jean-Jacques Rousseau declared that private ownership leads to corruption, leads to wars, leads to immorality, and therefore the state owns properties and it distributes it as it sees fit. We understand these two schools of thought, of private ownership and of society owns properties. Obviously, today we can divide into capitalism and socialism roughly, but these are the two schools of thought. Interestingly enough, 2,000 years ago, there were two schools of thought in Jewish thought, which were led by Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. The house of Hillel, famous sage, and the house of Shammai, also sage. Both of them were Talmudic scholars, and both of them understood the need for ownership, but they are in dispute regarding this type of ownership. There's a complicated Mishnaic text, which we won't get into in length, but what comes out of that Mishnaic text, which is, if you want to know, in the tractate of Peah, chapter 6, Mishnah Aleph, Mishnah 1, and what comes out of that text, according to some commentators, is as follows: that Beit Shammai says that there is a concept of private ownership, but only as a proxy of God. God owns all the land. He puts you here as the messenger. You're his proxy to own the land. And once you remove your ownership from the land, you say, my land, I do not wish to work it anymore, and therefore you remove yourself. Okay, disenfranchised or just, give the land away to someone. We called it in Hebrew hefker. You just give the land away. You remove ownership from the land. What happens in that case is that the land goes back to God, and he basically, in his system, gives it to the poor, etc., etc. Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, says no. There is a private ownership, just like Jean-Jacques says, God gave the land to the people and to every individual to own it. And therefore, if a person wants to remove himself from the land, he has to remove himself completely and not say that the land will now be belonging to the poor people or the rich people. He has to remove himself completely. This is the complicated Mishnaic text, but what comes out of it is something very simple. Both agree that the land in general belongs to God. But Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, comes and says, we are messengers of God and have the ownership here in the land as his proxy, as his messenger. Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, says no. Once God gave the land to humans, each one has an inherent right to the land that he works or that he bought for himself. It's just like the argument of the philosophers with one minor change, and that is, according to the philosophers, it is about society that owns the land, and does a person have a right or not? according to the sages of the Talmud, God has ownership of the land, and does he disconnect himself from the land and give it to us totally, or are we only his proxies? In this week's portion, we understand the concept of ownership of the land a little bit more deeply. We have a concept of the Jubilee year. 50 years a person owns the land, and on the 50th year, the land is removed from his ownership and goes back to its original owner. How is the calculation made? It's a little bit complicated, so we'll leave it at that. But after 50 years of ownership of a piece of land, your ownership is finished and it goes back to its original owners. And this is the greatest gift of Judaism to the world, defining and understanding what is ownership of property all about. And the ownership of a property is as follows. The Jubilee year teaches us to understand, and there's a constant reminder that there's no such thing as absolute ownership in this world. God is the owner of everything. We are merely here for a certain period of time. And that's what the Jubilee year reminds us, as the school of Shammai reminded us beforehand. But now comes the question. I would suspect, or I would imagine, that if the Jubilee year comes and the ownership of the land is removed from me, it should go back to heaven and God will give the land to whoever he pleases. But we find something interesting. It goes back to the original owner. Why does God, if he wants everybody to remember that he is the owner of the land, removes it from one individual and returns it to the previous owner? Must be that there is absolute ownership. Hence, it goes to the original owner. And here comes the true gift of ownership according to Judaism. God wants to tell us something very unique. And that is, God gave humans responsibility. If you remove the absolute ownership of land, and you say that people here are just proxies, they will say, well, I don't have responsibility to work the land, to develop it, to develop society, science, etc. I'll remove my responsibility from this world. After all, it belongs to God. Let him advance the land and science. God comes and says no. God comes and says as follows. You need a reminder in order to get you from your high horse and from your properties to know that I am the owner of the world. But it doesn't dismiss you from responsibility, and therefore, yes, an individual has an inherent right to the land to show you that you are responsible for your doings. You're responsible for this land. And the whole system of the Jubilee year is geared towards that understanding. Ownership equals responsibility. How does the Jubilee year work? It's not about communism and about socialism, about equal rights. That all of a sudden the poor will become rich, the rich will become poor. You level the playing ground. You just make everybody the same. No, it's not about equal rights. The Jubilee year says, yes, there are no debts. Land goes back to its original owner. There are no, mortgages. But it's not equal rights. It's about equal opportunities. No one can come and claim now, oh, I can't really advance in this world because I have so much debt on my shoulder. No. Now I really leveled the playing field. And now I restarted the whole system. You're starting from zero with a piece of land. And therefore, go ahead. It's your responsibility to get ahead. And you have no excuses whatsoever. You don't have a 50-year-old debt and your forefathers' debt and your bad luck of bad credit on your shoulders. Everything is finished. Everything is erased. Go start again. So with ownership comes responsibility. And this is the true greatest gift of Judaism. understanding what ownership and acquisition brings to the people. Yes, it is a right that is inherited. And yes, it is a natural right. But with ownership comes responsibility.